Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a new episode with Mark Tech. I hope I'm actually live. I hope everything is working well. I've ordered new adapters for my microphone, but they will only be arriving tomorrow. So if my audio quality becomes bad or completely breaks up sometime midstream, please let me know. Again, I don't want to reiterate that in every stream for a long time, but we have tremendous growth currently on the channel. Today is the first day where it has finally slowed down significantly. I guess we got a lot of momentum from the iPhone 15 announcement, the Apple Watch unboxing, all that stuff, even like the fine woven versus leather case comparisons. I'm so incredibly grateful. I hope everybody who is here can let me know what I can do to make it an even more worthwhile watching experience for you guys. And I would like to start with almost like a PSA, a public service announcement, which is right now we are getting a ton of developer betas. Developer betas now happen to be easier accessible than ever. So I think especially for an enthusiast community like mine, they're more relevant than they've ever been. And the biggest beta out of all this, I would say, is watchOS 10.1. It enables new double tap gestures. I do have the Ultra 2 for this, but I have not yet gotten to install this, unfortunately, though I will provide you with some feedback on obviously how well this works in the next coming days. Again, we have had all the controversy about this feature, whether or not it actually needs an S9 chip. But yes, if you have a Series 9 or an Ultra 2 and you have some way to install the developer beta, or I mean, it's not that difficult anymore, but if you're willing enough to do so, then proceed at your own caution, basically. On top of that, we also finally have the official release of macOS Sonoma. And you can install that basically on many Macs, even though, of course, with every year, more and more Intel Macs get phased out of support. Still, this is not yet fully Apple Silicon exclusive, which I know some people fear will not be too far off, given that Apple's development efforts are really focused on ARM chips, on chips that have integrated neural engines and stuff like that. And macOS Sonoma offers everything like that you've obviously heard of since WWDC, desktop widgets, game modes, new wallpapers, and much more. And of course, to coincide with that, we of course got iOS 17, iPadOS 17, watchOS 10, the latest tvOS version, and more, like not too long ago, basically last week. Wait, was it last week? Yes, it was last week. So yeah, if you want to have some fun with some developer stuff, I know on the watch it's not always recommended, but I doubt this will break too much. Given that it's a 0.1 update, it's not like you're installing the very first beta of a major new release. So if you want to have some fun with that, proceed, as I said before, at your own caution. Next is the actual news I wanted to talk about. Now, I will try to keep this stream somewhat light and pretty short because I am expecting my iPhone 15 Pro Max tomorrow, and that will obviously coincide with me doing an unboxing stream if I actually end up getting it. I still unfortunately cannot track it through UPS, so hopefully it actually works out fine. I usually trust Apple's predictions in the Apple Store app. For example, when my Apple Watch was on its way, Apple showed me that it would be coming September 22nd, while UPS was telling me it would be coming the following Monday, which would have been September 25th. And Apple ended up actually being right. So I hope that Apple is similarly more correct in this case. Um, and of course, with that, you can let me know what you would like to see me do and test out with the new iPhone. I will keep my iPhone 13 Pro Max somewhat enabled for the next week or so I can do comparisons, and then it becomes my mom's. um, yeah, so and the same goes for my Apple Watch Series 4. I'm still somewhat comparing it to my Apple Watch Ultra, uh, though the differences are so big when it comes to stuff like battery life. It almost warrants no comparison at this point. It's like 5 years difference. The Ultra is like twice as expensive as the base aluminum version. I had no cellular data on my Apple Watch Series 4, so there is no comparison to be made there. And there's much more internal storage, so if you want to save music and stuff on it and then just run around with AirPods and Apple Watches, obviously getting Series 9 and Ultra 2 kind of is a no-brainer if you care about getting just the most future-proof Apple Watch. So before we get started with the main topic of today, cheers. Oh my god, like this is getting embarrassing. Like it's every time I cannot open freaking a Coke. Let me just briefly hide here. Again, I will not be muting myself. As I've said before, my microphone will stop working if I just breathe at it too strongly. So, cheers, and unfortunately you have to listen to me drink. So, why am I interested in an iPad mini? As you guys know, I have an iPad Pro. And why would an iPad mini 7 in this case be interesting to me, given that, quite honestly, as exciting as like the redesign was, everything about the iPad mini currently right now is in a state of uncertainty, I would say. Usually when we talk about the iPad, we either talk about how much of a no-brainer it is, for example, for kids. This is what we usually would ascribe to an iPad 9th gen or even an iPad 10th gen, right? Something cheaper, but still something decent. And then when we start to talk about productivity, we usually talk about the iPad Air and up. Well, primarily, we like to talk about the iPad Pro because that's where M series chips were first introduced. That's where Stage Manager first came into play, where the Magic Keyboard became relevant. But a lot of that stuff since then has trickled down to an iPad Air. And we are supposedly getting an M2 based iPad Air, so that's not very... there's nothing unpredictable here. We are expecting an M3 iPad Pro sometime next year, probably around WWDC. But what about iPad mini? iPad mini is beloved by many people, but it's also completely ignored by even more people because in an era of ever so larger smartphones and in an era of even more productive tablets like the Air and the Pro, and in the era of the resurgence of the MacBooks thanks to Apple Silicon, well, where does that leave the iPad mini? Well, it leaves it basically as like a reading device to a degree, some note-taking apps. Now that it at least supports Apple Pencil 2, but there are a couple of things standing in the way of this. Like it's a 60 Hz IPS panel, and I mean, sure, the iPad Air also has a 60 Hz IPS panel, but it's a much larger panel. It's usually oriented more correctly, so you don't see the jelly scroll stuff that you would associate with something like the iPad mini. You also happen to have accessories like the Magic Keyboard that greatly improve your usability. And even if you wanted to use like external accessories for the iPad mini, the problem then becomes usually, well, the iPad mini does not support Stage Manager. The iPad mini does not support some of the now M1 inclusive apps, games, stuff like that. Final Cut, for example, even some of the newer games that will be coming to the new iPhone. The iPad mini uses the A15 chip currently, which was very nice of Apple to launch it. It was a pretty good device. But you see, like, even with how limited the iPad mini is, it starts to become more limited given that it's not been updated, given that people expect something like either a higher refresh screen and or a higher dynamic range screen, or maybe finally an OLED screen, which would also drastically improve response times and things like that. What about performance? Is Stage Manager too much for an iPad mini? Like, is it needed? Would Stage Manager work in an A series chip with 8 gigs of RAM, something like the A17 Pro? So there's a lot to talk about here, and this is this will also combine with some other stuff that we've talked about recently, and in my opinion, this is actually relevant because, well, sometimes Apple does very interesting stuff to devices that we don't really consider that important. I would say the iPad 10th generation, with some of its more peculiar choices, was one of those things. We don't know how Apple will choose to update the iPad mini. Maybe they'll just do a chip change or something like that. So let's just see how we got here, right? What are the exact rumors? For a second, let me please check if my stream is working correctly. Yeah, it works fine. Good. So this is a DigiTimes report, and it says that we should expect the release of a 7th generation iPad mini before the end of the year. Now, this is an article discussing stagnating global tablet trends. I've said before, I think those trends are kind of logical given the post-pandemic shift, but I also kind of believe that now that iPads and Macs have to share a lot of the market with each other, and given that Apple does not produce anything dirt cheap, so nothing like below $300 even, certainly nothing below $250 or $200. On the Mac side, they don't even really have anything under $1,000, which they would need at least something below $600 to really try to conquer a new market. So in this case, it's an interesting discussion to be had. I do sometimes believe it is overstated. I think rises and falls with tablets and PCs will become more and more common based on like just trends in the overall industry, based on whatever like generation actually comes out. Some generations are simply more compelling for upgraders than others. And of course, then also becomes the problem if you get like a really good, really future-proof quote-unquote product, well, then you also end up with the question of how long do you actually keep it, right? People can keep smartphones these days for like 6 years or longer, so if they really want to stretch it. On tablets and PCs, they don't even think about it, right? They kind of decide that they want to use it for as long as possible. At least on smartphones, you have like incentives in terms of like, oh, the camera is better, or if you had like a 4G phone, like, oh, maybe 5G will finally improve my cellular connectivity. Oh, I have a new port that works better with all my devices, and since it's actually a mobile product, how you charge it is actually really, really crucial. While on a tablet that you might only keep at home, that you might give to your kids, who cares what cable goes inside? Even if you have an iPad 9th gen, keep it, right? Nothing destroys the lightning cable on purpose unless you have a pet at home, and get a new lightning cable if that one ever breaks, because at least that is cheaper than getting a new tablet. So what about the iPad mini here? It's supposedly it's info from the suppliers who manufacture parts for iPhones and other Apple products. Well, I mean, that's a very wide way of saying of like, I mean, there are like dozens of suppliers, so I don't know. Its sources often provide reliable information. DigiTimes has a mixed track record. That's absolutely true. It is often best to view information from the site with some skepticism until the info is corroborated by additional sources, especially when it comes to rumors. Shrimp Apple Pro was one of the guys that reported on like a potential iPad mini upgrade much earlier. Let's say hello to my little shrimp here. Hello. Yeah. I know you. She likes get anxious the second you pick her up. Yeah. You can relax. I don't want her to touch my microphone here. I get really anxious about that. Mark Gurman earlier this year reported that an iPad mini update with a minor spec bump is not off the question, and then, as I said before, Shrimp Apple Pro also suggested a 7th gen iPad mini was in the works. However, we don't know anything about what exactly will be updated here. If anything happens before the holidays, now this is Mac Rumors takes basically, a chip upgrade may be the most likely feature of a new iPad mini. The 6th gen iPad mini currently contains the A15 Bionic, while the new iPhone 15 and iPhone 15 Pro use the A16 and A17 Pro respectively. A minor spec bump could also include upgrades to the front and rear cameras. Yeah, granted, those are a little outdated. Potentially bringing features like Photonic Engine to the iPad for the first time. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. The latest iPad, I think new cameras will probably not come to the iPad before the iPad Pro comes out. I just don't think that Apple cares about iPad cameras enough. And the latest iPad Pro models brought connectivity upgrades like Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3. Could some of those... It's difficult how they phrase this, because we are talking about iPad Pros, and eventually maybe we don't even know if like a new iPad Air would necessarily get like Wi-Fi 6E. Apple seems to currently really reserve it for like Pro devices. It's on the iPhone 15 Pro. It's on the MacBook Pro M2. It's not on the regular like a MacBook. It's on the iPad Pro with M2. It's on the MacBook Pro with M2 Pro and M2 Max. It's not on the M2 MacBook Air, neither the 13-inch. Granted, that came out before Apple started upgrading everything to Wi-Fi 6E, but it's not also on the 15-inch that came out a year later by the time Apple had started updating stuff to Wi-Fi 6E. Is it highly likely that all those things come to the iPad? I would actually argue probably not. Is there a chance that we could get like an OLED screen from the iPad this year? I would probably say not, unfortunately. By all accounts, the first OLED iPads will be the M3 iPad Pro, so I think this will actually be kind of a no-brainer, like in terms of no. It's the kind of generational upgrade that you would want to have for a product that actually has like a really high profit margin, that you could also advertise with like pro features and stuff like that. And with an iPad mini, like I assume it still would be like 60 hertz OLED, so it would still be like technically in some ways worse than like the IPS screens on the iPad Pros that are 11 inches. The 11-inch iPad Pro has like just a 120 hertz ProMotion screen, and then the 13-inch iPad Pro basically has a mini LED display, so that's nice. Though just OLED, I don't know. I think it would just look weird in the lineup, especially if like sometime later that year Apple also updates the iPad Air with still an IPS panel, because there is no chance that the iPad Air gets OLED tech before the iPad Pro. We've heard some ridiculous rumors about that a while ago. I don't actually think that this is in any way gonna happen. Just making sure that everything still works, yeah. And the ads work as well. I always try out a secondary account to see how it looks for everyone who isn't me while I stream. Well, the ads can be pretty long, admittedly. So yeah, what do I expect to happen? Well, it's kind of difficult to say what I expect, because what I expect will depend on things that I cannot control and that I simply don't know much about. Part of that is what exactly is A17 Pro supply looking like, right? 3 nanometer yields have supposedly been not that great. Does Apple have maybe enough A17 Pros that might need to have a GPU core disabled, right? What about A17 Pros that Apple might want to pair with 6 gigs of RAM? Because, I mean, Apple could potentially like even clock it like 100 megahertz lower or something on the iPad mini, with the simple excuse of saying, oh yeah, I mean, it's an iPad mini, it's even thinner than the iPhone and stuff like that. It doesn't even have that much of a bigger battery by all accounts. So yeah, we just clocked it a little lower to really maintain performance. And now we call this the A17, right? 1 GPU core less, 2 gigs of RAM less, maybe like an ever so slightly lower clock on the CPU. I think that's very, very possible, but we don't know. I don't know what the actual supply for A17 Pro looks like. I don't know what the cost of A17 Pro is like. I don't know what the exact yields of A17 Pro are like. However, the alternative is an A16. And the problem with A16s are that they are not really that much better than the A15 in the iPad mini that we already have. Like, what would be like the killer feature here at this point, right? I mean, an A16 is just ever so slightly faster in terms of CPU performance. It's, in terms of GPU performance, not really faster at all, unless you account for a little bit for like the higher memory bandwidth of using LPDDR5 instead of LPDDR4X. So I guess that could be an upgrade for it. Maybe with a decently high resolution screen, that bandwidth could actually make a difference somewhat. They could package it with like 6 gigs of RAM instead of the current 4 gigabytes. Let us just briefly go to like apple.com and just look at the exact specifications of like an iPad mini, right? Tech specs, I think that's decent. I mean, Apple does not say that it's 4 gigabytes, right? But like, well, for one, I do believe, by the way, that any upgrade is worth it if that upgrade comes with 128 gigabyte space storage. I honestly don't know why anyone would buy like a $500, like it is $500, right? Isn't it? Or is it? No, it's not 600. 600 is the iPad Air price. Yeah, it's $499. So I don't see why anyone would like. I kind of see like how you would upgrade those devices. Like you give like maybe an iPad Air like the M2, and then you keep everything the same, and you just give it 128 gigs of base storage at the same $600. And then to coincide with that, you give the iPad Mini an A17. Maybe not call it Pro, right? And then you give it also 128 gigs of storage, which also will allow you to like drop the pricing of the 256 gig version by $50. Not that allowing is necessarily the right word. Obviously, Apple is not hindered to even give you 256 gigs at base. The profit margins are there, but just to stay realistic, just say this would go up to 128 of base storage, and this would become $50 less expensive, where Apple maybe replaces it with a 512 gigabyte update, 512 gigabyte version that costs like maybe $50 more, or maybe even $100 more than this. Obviously, this is up for Apple's like money pinchers to decide, not for me. So I do not expect any screen change until we actually see a screen technology change. Like, I don't expect the bezels to get thinner, and therefore the overall device to shrink, nor do I expect the bezels to become smaller and the display to get larger. I think this could be realistic once we get into OLED iPad territory, but for now I don't think so. I think it would kind of be cool if Apple updated both the iPad mini and the iPad Air with just a ProMotion 120Hz screen, right? No mini LED, nothing fancy, stuff that has been in the iPad Pro since 2018. They could all use basically the exact same panel that also offers slightly higher peak brightness, and a little bit better contrast. I don't think there's anything prohibitive about that. Next, with buttons, I don't think much would change here. It would retain Touch ID. I don't think we'll see a Face ID focused update. Similar, I don't believe Apple would go like totally eSIM or anything like that. We would go with a USB-C to C cable, sure, 20 watts USB adapter. It should be noted that Apple still ships USB adapters with iPads, and I think the reason for it is that iPads are more likely to go into the hands of first-time Apple buyers or first-time tech buyers, maybe even in general. While with the iPhone, it usually is designed to go to somebody who either already has an existing like ecosystem, or somebody who, since they are paying like $800 to, or something on an iPhone, probably also has the money to buy themselves a USB-C power adapter. Again, 8.3-inch display. They don't really mention anything here about like 60 Hz. That's because obviously it is 60 Hz and not 120, and Apple usually only mentions high refresh as a spec point. It's a 326 ppi, so that's higher than, I believe, than 264, which is on the most other iPads. So I do believe that like the iPad Air has like somewhat deviating like pixel density. What is it? It's 264. No, it's still 264. And then when we look at the iPad Pros, we'll find 264. Wow, so Apple just uses the same, absolutely the same pixel density, and then they have a 12.9-inch screen, an 11-inch screen, a 10.9-inch screen, so just 1/10 of an inch of difference between the iPad Air and the 11-inch iPad Pro, and they just scale resolution with the different size. But then the iPad Mini uses basically the resolution of a potential. Wait, what is the resolution of the iPad Air? It's 2360 by 1640, while an iPad Mini is 2066 by 1488. So this is basically, if you were to scale down the wait, I actually have an idea. Like the iPad, what about the iPad 9th gen? What is the tech spec here? It's 2160 by 1620. My God, Apple does not have, like, I remember when Apple introduced the iPad mini, like it was 1024 by 768, which was the exact same resolution as the iPad 2 prior to it. And that was kind of the point, right? It was just supposed to be slightly more pixel dense, but then it supports the exact same apps. So what Apple ended up doing is they took then that screen and made it slightly larger, and obviously they also gave it Retina, so we had like double the pixel density in between. But we now have iPads that really don't match their pixels at all, basically. Well, this is 2160 by 1620 on a 10, so that's a little less resolution than on the iPad mini. So there is like no exact match. That's actually interesting. Not that it really is a hindrance to developers these days, because Apple has had for years now pretty good scaling mechanisms in iOS and in Xcode in general. So it all works fine. Also, they have stereo speakers here. Will be interesting if they ever consider going with like quad speakers. Personally, I doubt that, because it's kind of like an iPad Pro feature, and just size-wise, I believe it's more realistic that they would bring quad speakers to something like the iPad Air just before the iPad Mini. Yeah, so I kind of could see how they would maybe consider in a a high refresh rate display for it, but not necessarily anything fancy. That would also probably bring it up to 600 nits of brightness, which currently only the iPad Pros offer. Even like the mini LED MacBooks don't technically have 600 nits of SDR brightness. That's a little weird, but there is an app to go around that. And in terms of cameras, there's just like the same old, same old. We've had like pretty much those exact specs for years. We are now at Smart HDR5 with the iPhone, still Smart HDR4 here, and still nothing like night sight or any other functionality similar to that. But hey, we have 4K at 60 video recording, so that's nice. We obviously have the front camera. It's a 12 megapixel ultra wide, so that allows for wait, what does it call? Wait, huh? Wait, does the iPad mini not have center stage? Well, oh yeah, it does have it. Apple mentioned this as a video calling feature. That's weird. Like yeah, speakers are stereo and landscape. It still has Wi-Fi 6 and it has Bluetooth 5. I absolutely expect it to go with Bluetooth 5.3, but then again, Wi-Fi 6E, it depends. Maybe if it really comes to the iPad Air, then it probably will come to the iPad mini as well. But for now, it is a pro feature in Apple's eyes. So let's go then to the actual point that is most likely to be updated, which is the A15 Bionic. It's 6-core CPUs. That obviously wouldn't change because the A17 still has the same layout. I doubt that Apple has any aspirations to put the M2 into the iPad mini. It certainly isn't, an M3 certainly isn't ready yet, and I doubt its power consumption would be so much lower than an M2's, given what we are currently seeing with the A17 Pro, but one can always hope. It has a 5-core GPU, which at that time was actually the fully enabled A15. There actually was a 4-core A15 in the iPhone's 13, and then a 5-core in the iPhone 13 Pro. So that's actually interesting, if that could mean that Apple still might want to put an A17 inside that isn't binned down in terms of GPU core count. But given some of the power and thermal restrictions of like an iPad mini, I kind of would want it to be binned down. Also, just from like, not even like a raw environmental perspective, but just from the perspective of using as much of the stuff that actually gets produced. If there's a decent amount of A17 chips where you have to disable one of the GPU cores, why not take a 6-core A17 Pro, see that it has a broken GPU core, and then sell it as an A17 non-Pro in the iPad mini. I think that would work wonders for it. Also, of course, it would have a way faster neural engine at that point, and that would go a long way with some of the system features that Apple is pushing and just the general era of AI that we are all in. Cellular and wireless, we would probably get finally like a newer modem, maybe the X65 or something like that, maybe not quite the X70 that we got in the newest iPhone models. And this is actually interesting. If we actually put this is this is one thing that I find a little like confusing. because some people have said like, oh, the A16 does not have like a USB like data transfer driver for USB 3 speeds, right? And that is true. It probably does not have one by default. Neither likely does the A15. And they say that about the A16 because obviously we just got a USB-C iPhone with the A16 that does not support faster data transfer. But why does the iPad mini with an A15 chip support USB 3.1 Gen 1, which is 5 gigabits per second? Now, there are two lines of thought that you could have here. First is that maybe Apple has a USB control, like USB 3 level controller on the A15 because they knew they would put it into the iPad mini. Or more likely, they use like an auxiliary chip that manages that throughput for the A15, and then obviously through the motherboard communicates with it. I believe this is the way more likely thing, but just in general, even before we talk about like 5 gigabits per second, it would also enable like a 4K at 60, while currently it's like limited to 4K at 30, so that would be nice. But if it actually gets the A17, then we could see the iPad mini finally also support 10 gigabits per second. If we actually like go by tech specs, can I actually compare iPads here, right? The iPad mini 6th gen, the iPad 10th gen, and then the iPad Air 5th generation. Yeah, that's correct. That's what I want to like. Do they compare stuff like data throughput speeds here? Obviously the iPad Air features the M1, so that's kind of different here. Power and battery, connector. They don't mention like the specification specifically here, right? Well, yeah, the iPad Air is also in line for a Bluetooth upgrade at this point because the iPad 10th gen has a newer Bluetooth standard than it. Yeah, so this is like you have to go with like the actual tech specs. So I'll briefly jump into that for the iPad Air. I think it has a 10 gigabits per second port, right? I don't think it has an M1. Well, it has an M1 inside, but it doesn't have the Thunderbolt controller, right? So USB 3.1 Gen 2, which is 10 gigabits per second, which is the exact speed that the iPhone 15 Pro has. So if we go by that logic, we might get 10 gigabits now in the iPad Air, and then maybe simultaneously an M2 enabled iPad Air gets Thunderbolt. Now, not that M1 wouldn't support Thunderbolt, it's just you need that extra controller to be put there. So if you go with iPad, no, I shouldn't be clicking here. iPad Pro. Apple still calls them new, by the way. That's really interesting. Like tech specs, so they look at all the features of M2, like ProRes encoder, ProRes RAW, really good stuff here. If we actually go here with the ports, man, Apple really doesn't care about ports. They are like below zero, which I guess is kind of appropriate. It's below zero in the specifications. It's Thunderbolt / USB 4 port. It supports charging, display port, Thunderbolt 3 up to 40 gigabits per second, USB 4, and USB 3.1 Gen 2, which is obviously like a spec point that is integrated into it, right? Apple basically doesn't want to scare off people who look at, oh, it supports USB 4. Does that mean it doesn't support USB 3? And again, Thunderbolt 3, it's it's not like Thunderbolt 4 is actually faster, but for Thunderbolt 4 specification, I believe you need to support multiple display outs at the same time, and Apple instead only has one output, which at least by default there are some workarounds for that, and that supports up to 6K 60 hertz, which again goes up a long way from 4K 30 from what we've seen with the iPad mini. So yeah, I don't actually think there's that much more that an iPad mini will likely change. Yeah, I've talked about the processor. I said before this could get an A16, but then I don't know. It just would be such a nothing update. I don't know if it would excite anyone, and even if it had like 6 gigs of RAM, it's not like Apple has historically cared that much about upgrading their devices specifically with like future-proof RAM configurations. At that point, they will just wait it out until they can actually put even maybe like an A18 inside or something like that. So yeah, wait, if I actually go to like iPad compare, iPad compare iPad, can I actually use like an older iPad mini? Yeah, so let's take an iPad mini 6th gen here, and then compare it with an iPad mini 5th gen, and then compare it with an iPad mini 4. So the 6th gen is where we got the redesign that goes in line with the iPad Pro and the iPad Air. Before that, we've had gens and gens of the same design on the iPad, where is it? iPad mini 4. There. Okay. So if we actually compare this here, we went up from an A8 chip to an A12 chip. So don't believe for a second Apple wouldn't wait like a lot of generations for an upgrade, right? This is 4 generations, this is 3 generations. So there is a good chance that we might have to wait until something like an A18. And even if Apple launches it this year, why would Apple update it with an A16, right? This would be like the weirdest upgrade schedule. And then we would have waited 2 years to get a processor that is like minimally better. It's like an A16 over an A15 like makes sense in the iPhone specifically, right? Because the iPhone comes out every year. You want to leverage like 4 nanometer over N5P. You want to give it a little more performance. You want to use the latest display engine, the latest image signal processor and stuff like that, given how much focus there is on everything like supreme efficiency on the iPhone and as much feature support as possible. The Smeggy Bean 6000, what's good, dude? Everything's all right, dude. Thank you for joining. I don't think I've seen you yet in the chat. Now, this is a pretty like laissez-faire, you could say, stream. So if you want to ask me any questions, suggest any topics beyond what is like lined up. I'm pretty much wrapping up the iPad mini conversation. Is there something you still would like to know, or are you maybe joining us right now and don't yet even know what exactly I've been talking about for like the last half hour? You're new here, welcome. Well, we have added a lot of people recently, so welcome, everyone is welcome. That's actually pretty cute. Apple has like a different Touch ID symbol for the iPad mini because of that elongated power button rather than the home button, which obviously is circular. That's cute, some attention to detail here. Did you hear about the new iPhone 15? You mean the iPhone, like the iPhone 15 Pro that I ordered, the iPhone that I covered in multiple streams? I did just a stream yesterday about the newest processor in those iPhones and stuff like that. Yeah, I kind of heard about it. So yeah, this pretty much wraps it up for the iPad mini. I don't actually think there is that much more to add. Just in general, if anybody's like excited for new hardware, I kind of have to point you more into this direction, right? In 2024, we are getting new MacBooks and iPads with 3 nanometer chips. And now they're saying demand might come below expectations. It's hard to predict. I think um, this Maggie Bean, I really have to read your name. You can actually go back to my stream where I covered this. I think it's like a shocked memoji face next to a broken iPhone. It does not break in seconds. We have reacted to everything Apple's Pro drop video where it did pretty fine. Even like Jerry Rick Everything was not able to actually replicate it on the iPhone 15 Pro. It only worked with the Pro Max, like the breakage, like forcing it that easily. So yeah, it does seem a little more glass fragile than last generation because of, I assume, some internal changes and the titanium being more rigid, which means it absorbs force less so, which means the force gets like stuck in the glass and that leads the glass to breaking. But I wouldn't worry about it. Just in general, though, I will just tell you, use cases. I know this is like somehow a difficult topic for people, but like use cases. They don't hurt you. They improve your resale value down the road. You can get something like a... Here, I'll do a recommendation here, right? Pitaka. Here, look at this. Now, this is a specific design. I don't like this either, but stand higher, stars closer. What the fuck is that kind of for phones? Here. These cases, they're made of aramide fibers. They are pretty, like, this is what bulletproof stuff is made of. They're incredibly lightweight. They're incredibly like easy to hold, especially now that they will also like conform with the slight curvature of the brushed titanium. They don't add much weight. They're super durable. You should have zero worries if you use something like that. This Maggie Bean, you use a case and you always have. I dropped my phone at least 7 times and not a scratch. Well, kind of congrats here in that regard, which is that titanium should be somewhat better for scratches, for like like the kind of drop scratches than stainless steel. So yeah, I actually think this gen, I don't know if you even consider upgrading this gen, but I think you will be perfectly fine if you're considering the iPhone 15. Which one should I get? I don't like that pattern, that star pattern. What is or that hill pattern for that matter? I just like preferred black or blue, but that blue is too bright. What do you think, guys? Or guy? I know we have like one person watching in this stream. Hopefully more tomorrow as I unbox my iPhone 15 Pro though. No, that blue is way too bright in my opinion on that side. This one, this Maggie Bean newest Apple Gen is hardly a considerable upgrade. Well, that is the question though. What are you comparing it against? The era of year-to-year upgrades is long gone. It applies the same to Apple as it does to Android, as it does to Windows devices. Like, I don't see people rushing out to get like even AMD 7000 laptops over AMD 6000 laptops. I don't see Samsung users rushing out to get the Galaxy S23 Ultra over even an S21 Ultra, much less an S22 Ultra. The only exception being markets where previously those phones had to use Exynos chips, which suck. While if you use Snapdragon already, those people see really very, very little reason to upgrade. You're saying you like the gray and black? I guess this one is like purely black. So I assume you mean like this one? Yeah, it kind of looks the best, right? I think the slight glossy finish that we got here. I'm sorry, I'm covering some of this stuff up with my face, but you know what? I'm just gonna briefly move my face to the other direction, and then we're fine. We have 5 people watching now. Please let me know in the chat who you are, what your interests are. I do want to get to know my new community. We've added like 3,000 subscribers in a week. We now have 6 people watching. That's really incredible given that I really didn't expect anyone be interested in an iPad mini 7 stream. But we will be talking about a lot of general stuff. I do want to get to know you. If you are watching and you haven't yet subscribed, please consider doing so. And if you're someone who like enjoys my content already, then consider like supporting me directly through something like a super chat, because this channel is now fully monetized and supports that. Yeah, so I do have like a Pitaka case with my iPhone 13 Pro, right? So I probably will like, and oh, of course you guys should know that I am ordering them the titanium blue iPad, the titanium blue iPhone 15. This magazine, you make a fair point. Apple aren't the only perpetrators when it comes to new low upgrade ceiling gens. Well, that's well, to me the point is, so I actually have been pretty like impressed by a lot of the stuff in the iPhone 15 Pro specifically. I think like the A17 is not as impressive by like your raw CPU metrics maybe, but it has like ray tracing and it works with AAA games because it has finally 8 gigs of RAM. You finally get USB-C, and not just USB-C, but actually fast USB-C, USB-C that outputs 4K at 60, which actually is really good if you're like working a lot with external stuff. The A17 enables a lot better camera functionality to the point where even DxOMark, which really doesn't vibe with how Apple usually upgrades their cameras, like named the iPhone 15 Pro the second best camera, smartphone camera on the market. And then you have your continued improvements. You have an even better 5G modem. You have a second generation ultra wideband chip. You have Wi-Fi 6E versus Wi-Fi 6. You have 5x telephoto camera on the Pro Max with a larger sensor. So it's not just better for like wider, like further away zoom, but it's also better in like low light scenarios. So there's a lot of like, it's almost like it uses a new metal material that makes it lighter and more comfortable to hold because it's slightly brushed, right? There's a lot, I think, that comes together. It has the action button, which makes the iPhone more customizable than it has ever been before. And then when you consider those are just features that I named over the iPhone 14 Pro, if you are coming from something older, for example, my iPhone 13 Pro Max does not get as bright. It does not have a 48 megapixel main sensor. There's so much that just stacks up once you might coming up from something like an iPhone 12. It's kind of a no-brainer. The 8 gigs of RAM was shocking to see. Yeah, you have to consider that Samsung technically has an 8 gigabyte S23 Ultra version. That's actually their starting configuration, and Apple matches that. That's really fascinating. We've had like eras, I've covered them in some of my prior streams, where Apple had like 4 times less memory, and now we are 1-to-1, and then Samsung has like a config that has 50% more RAM, and then maybe finally the S24 Ultra could give you a 16 gigabyte option. And at 8 gigabyte, I kind of expect the iPhone to like in RAM outperform easily any 12 gigabyte Android. You have an iPad mini 2, so that goes back actually quite a while. Let me just see the spec points here, right? Can I go down? Yeah, an iPad mini 2. Which chip is that even? I don't even know. It's an A7 chip, okay. Still just barely functional, but the RAM is through the floor. It is 1 gigabyte, right, on the A7. it can barely hold Safari open without crashing. Though you have to consider it's not just RAM at that point. Like the architecture is outdated, and there's just so much wrong with any A7 device these days. That's like the chip from the iPhone 5S. That's stuff from 2014. You wouldn't call it a no-brainer. It's still, well, 1,200 euros. It's more than 1,200. Well, I guess the base version, the base non-Pro Max. A beefy phone, but with a hefty price. Well, when I say no-brainer, I kind of mean for people that are already invested, not just into the Apple ecosystem already, but into the idea of getting an iPhone, right? Like, there are a lot of switchers who, for years, have said, well, I wouldn't want to switch from Android to a Lightning that had, to 2015 is better than 2014, right? People have said that they wouldn't switch from Android to an iPhone that ran Lightning, and now they aren't just switching from an Android to an iPhone with USB-C, but then with an iPhone that has faster USB-C than most high-end Android devices. Like the Galaxy S23 Ultra only has 5 gigabits per second on its port, right? That's what I mean with like a no-brainer. If you are either coming from something much older than a 14 Pro, obviously, especially if you're coming from anything older than a 13 Pro, right? You have to imagine like the 12 Pro did not have ProMotion, and when you go back to like the 11 Pro did not even have 5G. So there's a lot of stuff that just adds up and adds up. The Lightning cord sucked so bad. I think it's fantastic that the EU forced their hand. Well, it's fantastic that we finally have a unified port. I wasn't that happy that it was like government enforced, even though I'm kind of a lefty and usually, I'm not a government lefty, so it's not like an argument that is for me. But usually people that are political close to me are very pro-government intervention. I am not. You've had at least 6 replacement lightning cables. Dude, what are you doing with it? Like, do you have like a pet or a child that destroys it? I have had one broken lightning cable over all my years. The longest one that I've used, I probably used for like 5 years. And then I got because I also like give my mom just my better cables. I usually have like always additional cables because those are longer. I get like braided cables that hold on for a long time. Because I have like a 3-meter anchor cable, and that one is super thick because it's also, of course, 3 meters, so it needs like the extra stuff for the resistance. But and that holds up pretty fine. The only cable that ever broke on me was a Type C to Type C cable, I believe from Aukey, but that was their fault. It like broke almost immediately once I've had it. You've always had charging problems with it. Well, with the iPad or with cables in general, because it could be your iPad at that point, right? Though I kind of don't think it would make a lot of sense to try to fix anything about that iPad, right? Would you consider then upgrading at some point? Like you have an iPad mini 2, would you be interested in something like an iPad mini 7 at that point? Or could I interest you in some M3 devices, like an M3 iPad Pro that will feature OLED displays and stuff like that? And obviously everything else that has been updated over the years. Just the iPad, the outlets in my house are very old though. Well, yeah, that kind of could like be a problem long term. Like sometimes a bad outlet might fry a cable or a device if you're really unlucky. Currently I am on a newer iPad. What do you mean? Do you have like access to a new iPad, or are you saying like you'll check which iPad you're using? That's cool. I'm interested, definitely. And before we get back into it, let's see if I was right. And I kind of am believed that I will be proven right. Now, this is an analyst thing, so it's not like a concrete like rumor prediction, but this is coming from Jeff Poo, who is pretty reliable usually. So what is he saying? Well, in a research note with investment firm Haitong International Securities, Pooh said, "We view A17 Pro as a transition design and now expect all iPhone 16 models to feature A18." Now, let me just briefly cover everything up. Right then, notes. Wait. Oh, here. Open note in your window. Okay, here it is. Here, you have a 7th gen iPad. Well, how much newer is a 7th gen iPad? iPad 7th gen. It works, it's a 10.2. Well, it is an A10. Well, yeah, an A10 will go a long way. And that also has like, I think this one specifically has 2 gigs of RAM. Yeah, I don't think it has 3. I think the only A10 device with 3 gigabytes was the iPhone 7 Plus. But yeah, I wanted to show you guys something, which is this article, right? I've now tried covering this, which is this is the prediction from Jeff Poo, which is he is saying that the iPhone 16 would get the A18 based on N3E, the iPhone 16 Plus would also get A18 based on N3E, then the iPhone 16 Pro would get an A18 Pro based on N3E, which is again TSMC's second generation 3nm design. And then the 16 Pro Max would obviously have the same chip. So look at what I gave as a prediction not too long ago in one of my last 2 streams or something like that. Here, what did I say? Well, I said the A18 would come into the iPhone 16 and 16 Plus. The A18 Pro would come into the iPhone 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max, or at that point we might get an Ultra. They would both be based on N3E. In fact, they would both be the same die pretty much. We would have the same CPU core configuration, maybe with like different clock speeds. As an example, I gave like 3.8 and 4 gigahertz. It depends. Both could technically be still clocked higher than even the A17 Pro was. Maybe they will drastically improve instruction per clock, and then they could get away with slightly lower clock speeds than expected. This is how I kind of saw this. Then if we keep the 6 GPU core count from the A17 Pro, assuming we don't get like 7 or 8 GPU cores on an A18 Pro, I kind of expect one of those cores to be cut. The Smeggy Bean saying, "Damn strong predictions, my guy. glad you approve." And then I would say we would have like 1 GPU core cut away from this for binning purposes and also just differentiation purposes. I think both would be 8 gigabytes. I don't think iOS needs that much more. You would then have a slightly slower memory, which Apple could still like recycle basically from the iPhone 15 Pro, which would be the LPDDR5 memory here. And then we would use either LPDDR5X or maybe something like LPDDR5T. This one is like, I believe LPDDR5X is like 8400 mega transfers per second, and then LPDDR5T is 9600, I actually believe, up from 6400. So LPDDR5T would actually be exactly 50% faster, which would be a really nice increase to to bandwidth, which would be pretty much the increase that we saw from LPDDR4X to LPDDR5. And then just as device differentiation, I would assume we would get like better cooling finally in the next gen pros, because I don't think Apple honestly needed better cooling in the 15 Pros to convince people to upgrade, given everything else those phones offer. I'm not even sure if the 16 Pro will have much better cameras, larger sensors, stuff like that. It will have larger display, probably much bigger battery thanks to using stacked batteries. But more cooling would at least be nice. What's the cooling rig on the iPhone 15? What do you mean rig? Do you mean like the actual like cooling assembly in the device, like the structure? It's just aluminum cooling currently. There's no vapor chamber heatsink. There are no like heat pipes transferring heat throughout the device. It's like it does like at least 2 watts less of proper power, heat dissipation versus Android devices. So if you have like the iPhone dealing relatively well with like 4 watts, maybe 4.5 watts, comparable Android devices will usually give you more than 6 watts of proper heat dissipation. Let's see what they predicted here. So they are outlining that this is a second generation of 3 nanometer over N3B. It should be said that they probably will not even be able to really use N3B next year. I mean, TSMC probably would be happy, but since I doubt that Apple would want to use N3B, I kind of believe that TSMC will just start producing N3B and then completely ignore it forever. Similar to what like happened with like 10 nanometer, right? 10 nanometer. No, what was the chip base? No, I actually think like 10 nanometer was like used for almost nothing. It was like used for the A11 chip, and then we switched to 7 nanometer, and that was then used for years. So heat dissipation is an issue that needs resolving. Yes, if you're a power user and you don't have like something like Razer MagSafe cooler. If you don't use something like this, then yes, heat dissipation will be an issue. If you're like doing something hyper demanding and it's relatively warm outside, then your display could dim, your performance would be throttled. With something like, I kind of wish this was also a battery. I'm not gonna lie, this is a cool accessories, but for $70 it's a little like overpriced. It's like it's a 7-blade fan with up to 6400 RPM. It's quiet, it has a power switch. It comes with a USB-C power cable that is super long. You probably would need like a smaller cable to actually use it comfortable with the new iPhone. And it has an LED that indicates pairing and power status. So something like this is cool. Hopefully we'll get more throughout this. The smelly bean, the smeggy bean, if you are actually interested in my coverage of potential heat issues, watch my last video, which is called "Is the A17 Pro in iPhone 15 Pro an Overheating Disaster?" A reaction to Geeker Vance A17 Pro analysis, and also to some news reports that had come out. Maybe because it's a relatively long stream, try watching it on a speed up or something like that. Yeah, so let's go back to what they expect to happen. Given that the iPhone 16 lineup is around a year away, you don't say. Pooh is likely making an educated guess. Well, it's pretty much my guess, so I guess that means it's educated. With the marketing names, well, yeah, I mean, Apple could like call one the A17 and then the other one an A18 Pro. I just don't see much utility in calling this the A7. Like, I just don't see the utility in taking an N3B design, having to port it to N3E, because don't forget, those designs are not natively compatible. You need some real architectural like rethinking to port something from N N3B to N3E. So why not just build one new chip, scale that chip properly between devices based on need, based on cooling capabilities, based on battery sizes and everything else like that, and then sell them, and then you can still say that both the iPhone 16 and 16 Pro have the latest generation of chips. One just happens to have an A18 while the other has an A18 Pro. It worked very well for like the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro. The A15 did not have a separate branding between the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Pro, but guess what? You had one fewer GPU core inside the iPhone 13 versus the 13 Pro, and you had 4 gigs of RAM instead of 6 gigs of RAM. In this case, you would get the same amount of RAM but slower memory. You would also get like one GPU core cut off, and as I've said before, depending on the cooling, battery, etc., there might be some good reason to also ever so slightly differentiate them by top clock speed. He doesn't really say anything else. But there is some credibility to him. He also predicted that the iPhone 15 Pro would have 8 gigs of RAM and that the Pro Max would have a higher starting price, which is actually the correct way to put it, because there was no price increase on the 15 Pro Max, given that the higher starting price coincides with just getting rid of the 128 gig config, and for you're paying the same money for a 256 gigabyte model as you were paying last year for 14 Pro Max 256 gigabyte model. Yeah, so this is that. I think this makes a lot of sense. In fact, I could just show it to you guys, right? iPhone, compare iPhones. Can I show you much older iPhones on that list? Yeah. So if I compare the iPhone 13 Pro Max and I compare it with an iPhone 13, right, you will see they both have an A15 core, but this one has a 5-core GPU, because at that point that was the maximum, and this has 4 cores. That's as easy as it gets. And then this Apple does not advertise memory configurations on the iPhone, but this had 6 gigs of RAM and this had 4 gigs of RAM. And when we go back 1 year prior on the 12 Pro Max and the 12, there was like no 12 Plus or something, right? They had the exact same core config, right? 6 CPU cores, 4 GPU cores, but you had 6 gigs of memory here and 4 gigs of memory here. When we actually go to the 11 Pro Max and the 11 actually had the exact same chips with the exact same memory, so that doesn't prove my point. But when we go to the iPhone XS and like the iPhone XR, what we'll find is they have the same A12 chip, but here we had 4 gigs of memory and 3 gigs of memory. So if with some proper different, but also we had like less GPU cores, cutting off one of those GPU cores would result in literally cutting off like 25% of performance. That's a pretty big deal. While here, if we just go down from 6 GPU cores to 5, well, that also reduces our need for super high bandwidth, and now we can actually get away with using LPDDR5. But here we actually need that LPDDR5X or 5T, given that we also have more GPU cores. So those are really, in my opinion, smart distinctions that could be made. Knowing Apple and knowing that they're usually pretty smart, I'm kind of inclined to believe that this would happen. I mean, hell, like, go to the Mac, right? Like, Apple doesn't like Mac, compare Mac, right? You have like an M2 chip and you have like up to 10 cores, right? They even differentiate like a cores without any branding. So why wouldn't they learn from the actual Mac and go with something like a Pro branding or a Max branding, right? Imagine how that would look, right? You would have an A17, similar how you just have M2 here, or you would have A18, similar to how you have M2 here, but then you would have A18 Pro, and I doubt Max would really be a necessary thing to create for given the iPhone's limitations. But hey, if Apple made like an Ultra iPhone at some point, or maybe like a foldable iPhone, that could be a point for that. So there's a lot that I actually didn't know that the 13 oh that's the 14 inch. What is the exact display size of the 15 inch? It's 15.3. Okay, that's a nice size difference. I kind of for a second thought, wait, what? So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It has a lot of like precedence in Apple's marketing across like their different device categories. And besides that, I actually don't have that much more to say on those products. Anybody in the chat who would like something specific for me to address? Again, tomorrow my iPhone 15 Pro Max is likely arriving, so I'll probably do an unboxing stream. I cannot guarantee that this will happen, unfortunately, because UPS is a little unreliable, or a lot, but hopefully it all works out similar to how it worked out with my Apple Watch. I mean, well, technically my iPhone was promised between September 27th and October 3rd, but getting on September 28th is by no means a big loss for me. Even September 29th I'm perfectly fine with still. Yeah, so just closing this, making this larger here. I don't actually think there's that much more to cover, right? I think if we just go to like see what is going on, right? Oh, okay. I actually think this is cool to cover. Okay, this is as I've said in the beginning of my stream, I actually didn't have yet time to upgrade my devices. I'll be doing so probably right away after this video. But what do we have? We have in like the latest betas, right? iOS 17.1 beta. What are we getting? Thank you, Mac Rumors, by the way. I am kind of exploiting them a little today. We have Apple Music favorites, so you can favorite songs, albums, playlists, and artists. Favorite music is added to the library and improves recommendations. Favoriting replaces the prior love system, and favoriting can be done from the lock screen's now playing widgets. Okay, cool. Doesn't really change anything for me drastically. A star next to a track in an album means that it's a favorite. Wait, where does it show? I don't see a star here. While a dot is next to the most played track. Okay, some interesting distinctions. Eventually, Apple plans to provide a favorite songs playlist and offer collaborative playlists, but these features do not appear to be implemented as of yet. AirDrop, they can now be we actually have finally like the much anticipated AirDrop feature. This is for anyone who wants to transfer something really big. If you like start transferring it over AirDrop, you can continue over Wi-Fi and cellular if maybe the other person suddenly has to leave. So that's a really nice thing. That means you will not have to stay close to someone if you are transferring a large number of files or very large files, as I've said. Name drop comes to Apple Watch, so that's part of WatchOS 10.1 and 17.1. I actually haven't tried it. I've tried like name drop on my iPhone. I kind of assumed it came to the Apple Watch, but given that nobody else in my home has an Apple Watch that supports WatchOS 10, that was kind of the bottleneck for me even testing it. It's interesting that like some people have complained about this. I think people just don't get how betas work. Like Apple has added a lot of ringtones and text tones in iOS 17, and they are now gone in 17.1. The point about this is that betas are not usually like based exactly on the immediately like last version that you get. Like likely some of the iOS 17.1 beta might just be a continuation of some of the later betas of iOS 17. And now that we have a beta process for 17.1, since again this is also a beta still, you would probably like go through like 2-3 revisions, and then Apple would finally make it give it feature parity with whatever official iOS release we currently have out there, like 17.02, for example, maybe even 17.03 at that point. Or you know what I'm saying, right? An immediate beta does not always have to have the latest stuff that was just introduced in the official version. That's just not how it works. It usually works that way for Apple because they have a very regular schedule of betas, but sometimes not. Sometimes a beta will not have all the security fixes of an official version that might even launch prior to that beta. Sometimes a beta will not have a bug fix that just came out in like a 0.1 release, 0.01 release or something like that. That's perfectly normal. It's just that with bugs or something like that, people don't pay much attention to it. But if it's an actual feature or something like a lot of ringtones or wallpapers, then people tend to notice. UK bank balances in the wallet app. Okay, cool. Books app, the Reading Now section, the Books app has been renamed to Read Now. That's not a big thing. The Journal app is still not there. Okay, there is no sign of the promised a journal app in iOS 17.1, but there are mentions of journaling suggestions in the code. Wait. Oh, Mac Rumors has actually some exclusive stuff for us, guys. It's about the iPhone SE4. This stream is turning out longer and longer than I expected. But I guess this will probably be the last thing we talk about, right? Significant changes are expected to arrive with Apple's 4th gen iPhone SE. Mac Rumors has learned. So what have they learned exactly? By the way, like kudos to like my ad blocker. Like after the last update, it really seems to be really good at managing all the ads here. The iPhone SE4, known internally under the codename Ghost. So Apple has like an internal ghost protocol, I guess. It's expected to receive a new design derived almost entirely from the base model iPhone 14. So that would be the second generation notch, right? Not the one that we had from iPhone 10 to iPhone 12. We have the iPhone 12 era, a rectangular design, but I guess Apple could still brush it off just a little bit, the aluminum, if they really wanted to. What else? It's relatively slim bezels, but it's bezels that are more comparable to the iPhone 12, 12 Pro, 13 Pro, and then 14. Not the bezels that we have on the 14 Pro or 15, and certainly not the same bezels that we have on 15 Pro. I would also expect this to be like a 60 Hz OLED, but granted, a 60 Hz OLED, even if it is like the exact same panel of the iPhone 14, which does not get quite as bright as the display on the regular iPhone 15 or on the 14 Pro or the 15 Pro, is still a very nice and usable screen. And if it's actually cheap, like if it's like $500 or lower, then it's definitely targeting a market that doesn't really care about high refresh rate. It will use a modified version of the iPhone 14 chassis and will even maintain iPhone 14 task parameters for internal testing. As far as the chassis is concerned, 2 major changes are expected. Wait, an action... Oh, wait, it would get a USB-C port, C port, of course, and an action button. Well, then my question is, when is it coming out? Well, I guess we'll see. It's a multi-purpose button. It's currently only on the 15 Pro. It's not on the regular 15. It received a I get USB-C port will comply with European Commission. That could actually be really interesting if Apple at some point like gave it like at that point, maybe they could like give USB 2 speeds only to the SE and introduce faster USB-C speeds for non-Pro iPhones, and maybe Pro iPhones at that point will have like 20 gigabits per second or something like that. But obviously that is just speculation. The iPhone SE4 is also set to receive blah blah blah. No significant changes are planned for the chassis compared to the iPhone 14. Wait, what would be the true changes? It's USB-C and the action button. Yeah, okay. And it will likely not feature the curved edges of the iPhone 15 lineup. Well, I guess for just differentiation factor and just so they can really reuse everything from the iPhone 14, I think that makes sense. As for the back of the device, the next iPhone SE will feature a single camera with the flash aligned in an arrangement similar to the 3rd Gen SE. The exact design of the camera bump, however, remains unclear at the time of writing. Really? Just a single camera, no ultra-wide, not even like the old ultra-wide. Apple has developed at least 5 different designs for the camera bump with minor differences among them. They fall into 2 major categories: a camera and flash encompassed in a single oblong-shaped camera bump, and only the camera ring raised from the main backplate surface. Well, yeah, that's a little hard to predict. The SE4 preliminary information suggests that the SE4 may feature 48. Yeah, I kind of expect it to be 48 megapixels for the reason that SEs actually have decent cameras at the time of launch when they come out. The last SE was kind of an exception in that regard. Like, look at something like even like the original SE, right? That was pretty great hardware when it came out. But like 48 megapixel would allow Apple to advertise like the 48 megapixel like main like 24 millimeter 6 or something that they've introduced as modes, and then also a 2x lossless zoom where it just zooms and crops in onto 12 megapixels at the center of the sensor. Then Apple could basically say, oh, it's one camera but it's actually 4 lenses or something like that. That would be pretty wild at that point. It will likely receive a new OLED panel derived from the iPhone 14, which would definitely be a big upgrade over the old one. The device will not feature Touch ID home button, but will instead have Face ID. Yeah, I absolutely believe that, because why would you redesign anything about the device? It probably would just be cheaper to use Face ID that you mass source anyway, and you have tech for that old notch by that point, by like in masses. It's really not difficult for Apple to produce that kind of Face ID. But hey, even just by Face ID standards, that's like the kind of Face ID that also does like both portrait and landscape recognition. So that's definitely good. If you're coming from really old biometrics, that's a huge update. Multiple references to Pearl, Apple's internal codename for Face ID, and associated hardware have been spotted in relation to the 4th Gen SE. Apple is also working on an in-house 5G modem. Well, yeah, that's actually, if Apple's 5G modem is like currently known to be severely behind Qualcomm's latest offerings. But let's say Apple really manages to make their 5G modem work really well at like low power. It would have like maybe half the peak speeds. It would have no millimeter wave support, not even in the United States. They could pair it here. I don't see much of a problem here, if they even get it out at that point. So that project, honestly, on Apple's internal own modem might die. Apple might not want to just like sink in money into it and then hope to at some point get finished. At some point it just will be easier to accept that Qualcomm basically won that battle. Current information suggests that the new modem is being tested on the SE4 and the derivative on the 15 Pro Max, which I assume is kind of like just a prototype for testing, known as D84S. Originally, the 5G modem was meant to take its debut with the iPhone 16 lineup. That definitely isn't happening. It's probably not even happening with the iPhone 17. According to information from our sources, this may no longer be the case. Additionally, Qualcomm recently issued a press release release stating that the company would be providing smartphone modems for Apple until 2026. 2026 would be like 2024 would be the iPhone 16, then 2025 would be the iPhone 17, and if that iPhone gets like sold until like late 2026 and Apple gets rid of all old modems, that could explain how it gets until 2026. If Apple keeps like some older models in place, that could easily go to 2027. Quite honestly, I don't see how they get fully rid of Qualcomm. Guys, can you see me? Can you hear me? I just lost connect. Okay. So yeah, the tech problems really have been like unnerving to me recently, but hey, we fixed this relatively quickly. I connected it to my iPad's hotspot. I apologize for the problems. Thankfully, OBS didn't fully disconnect me from my stream, and once the stream has actually finished processing, I'll try to cut that out from the video. So I just wanted to look at this, right? The iPhone, let's compare iPhone models, right? And let's just look at like the 15 Pro Max, then the latest 15, and the iPhone SE, which again, Apple doesn't even label as like, well, I mean, they deliberately label this new iPhone models and not just current iPhone models, because the SE is like, did this exist in like a different universe? But man, the red is like really great. So it's a 4.7-inch LCD panel, right? Versus 6.7 and 6.1 inches. It has actually a decent CPU, right? It actually scales pretty well. A17 on the 15 Pro, A16 on the 15, A15 on the SE. But then you have a single camera system that is 12 megapixel main, no new modes, no like next gen portraits, no next gen focus technology, just 1x optical zoom. It's interesting, by the way, that Apple labels this as 2x optical, because it's definitely still not fully optical. I mean, look at this here. Apple does not advertise like 1.2 and 1.5x here as optical options, even though they aren't that different functionally from the 2x zoom. But regardless, look, 15 hours of video playback, that's like the best stat it can have, right? Because its battery is so small, but at least the display is small, and at least it has like a native encoders for the video, so that's kind of its best battery stat in that regard. In terms of scaling to everything else, it has of course lightning with USB 2 speeds. It has no Face ID. Basically, it has nothing modern about it except for probably 5G. If you still want to label 5G as like something modern by today's standards, I personally don't think so. Let me just see if my stream is working fine. Yeah, okay. So let's continue what we see here. So 48 megapixel OLED, iPhone 14 design, Face ID. So there's such a big change over what we just saw here, right? This like, yeah, like something like the action button might not even be like a necessary upgrade here, but hey, it is what it is. If Mac rumors will stand by any of that reporting, we'll see how it develops. For now, it seems to be in an early development process, and changes are always possible. They don't bring up any concrete date expectations or something like that. Yeah, so we don't even know when it would exactly come out. So by that point, even these spec points might not be that impressive given everything else that we might get. So, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for like the fallout that we had in the end. I hope you still enjoyed it. I hope anybody who watches this video will consider subscribing to the channel. Is still my OBS acting up again? Nope, it just froze on my screen on the iPad. I hope that tomorrow I'll be like streaming my iPhone 15 unboxing, but we'll see. As always, I will let you know through Twitter, or you can always check it out here. Please hit the notification bell so you will actually be informed about this. And yeah, again, as I've said before, if you haven't yet subscribed and liked the content, please consider subscribing. If maybe not for this video, maybe consider giving super chats or super stickers for future videos as you watch live. Consider following me on Twitter. The links to Twitter and my Patreon are in the channel description. And without further ado, thank you guys so much. I'll see you in the next one. This is Mark Tech tuning out.